Welcome to the Happily Family Conference. We're your hosts. I am Cecilia Hilkey.
And I'm Jason Hilkey.
And we're delighted today to have Dr. Joseph Lee with us. Joe is a psychiatrist with a private practice in Southern California. Early in his practice, he saw that his patients were clearly getting better, but didn't seem quite well. His search to help people truly thrive led him to a truth-based perspective that he's been applying personally and professionally, built around developing self-worth, meaningful relationships, and lifelong optimal healthiness. Becoming a parent made him even more intentional about every aspect of his own life, trying to figure out the best way to raise his kids while maintaining his own health and well-being. Welcome, Joe. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Peter, Joy.
Thank you. Hi, friends.
I got to first say, just so people know, we're going to call him Joey because we
or Joe.
Or Joe. Okay.
Yes.
So Dr. Lee, Dr. Joseph Lee, thank you for being here with us. And we've just known you for a long time. So I think Joey comes out and I don't know.
No problem.
I can't stop but saying that. All right. Anyhow.
Okay. So we wanted to talk to you about anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I read an article recently that I wanted to talk to you about because it was about helping kids with their anxiety. And it was all about this brand new program that was really great at helping kids with their anxiety, because what it did is it helped parents with their anxiety and the kids got better. Right. So what does that tell us? What have you seen?
So I think that, well, first and foremost, anxiety is a universal human experience, right? Whether we are children or we are adults. And one of the reasons why we all feel anxiety at different times in our lives is because anxiety is, like all emotions, ultimately something that is adaptive, helpful, useful for our overall health and well-being. So it's normal, and it's also good that both parents and children do experience anxiety at different times in their lives. But I think that obviously, I think we're going to get into it, what's the difference between healthy, positive anxiety versus, things that are actually harmful or detrimental or make life more difficult, the kinds of anxieties that you feel in that way. And I think, with parents, it kind of makes sense, especially new parents, maybe, where it kind of makes sense that if you've never been a parent before and you've kind of only sort of experienced it peripherally, well, first and foremost, there's no reason that you're supposed to be an expert or completely competent at something that you've never done before. So inevitably, you're going to go into those experiences with some level of trepidation. And because it's, in the context of like raising children, it also feels like the stakes are very high, and so I think that sort of combination of inexperience, which people can't help, along with the but this is really important and I don't want to mess up, kind of creates an environment where, it's very easy for parents to become anxious. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because, for example, having appropriate anxiety kind of does get you to have this awareness and judgment that says, I should take this seriously, because if I do, then, maybe there's going to be better outcomes, specifically because I'm giving it the energy and attention that this needs. And then the opposite would also kind of be true. If something actually is pretty serious and important and I'm kind of negligent, then the probability of that thing coming around to hurt me or people I care about, that's also more probable, right? So listening to anxiety, being able to know what to do with it is pretty important. So maybe today's talk will be educational for parents in terms of how to help their kids, but it would be great if it was also insightful for parents themselves to kind of know a little bit more about the anxieties they feel themselves.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
So I think for maybe for the people listening, and certainly for me too, the $1 million question is, at what point do I know, oh, this is something I shouldn't be worried about, I'm taking this a little too seriously,
Mm-hmm.
or, oh, this is something I really should be worrying about, I'm not paying enough attention to that.
Kind of like the good anxiety versus bad anxiety.
Yeah, and because it's really easy for me to look at other people and be like, woo, she is way uptight about that thing. She does not need to worry about that.
Yeah.
Or oh gosh, come on, wake up, pay attention. So how do we figure out what we should pay attention to?
Well, I think one of the things that's very much tied to how much anxiety any given person experiences has to do with a couple of things, but one of those things is our own judgment as to whether or not we are capable of handling a problem or a situation, right? Because I think anxiety is supposed to be this extra insight and extra energy that's appropriate for the moment to kind of take care of something. Versus, there's a lot of things that we're very competent in life that ultimately may be difficult and complex for other people, but we might have tons of experience doing it. And even though it's serious and it's important, if we're very, very good at doing something, we tend not to feel anxiety. We tend to feel very, very capable, or we might not even notice, right? So I think anxiety is a very specific experience related to a moment where the judgment you've made is not just that, oh, this is a problem, but it's kind of like, this is a situation and a problem where it's necessary for me to give it a little bit more attention and effort and energy, because on some level, it's not one of these things that I know, like, I'm super good at or super confident in or completely well-resourced in or something like that. So anxiety is meant to kind of give you that extra oomph of insight and energy. So maybe we could just kind of finish that thought, which is the opposite end of the spectrum then is we tend to have the most anxiety about a problem at a level that's kind of proportional to our sense of helplessness, right? So on one end of the spectrum, you can have a problem, but if you are very, very experienced and competent, you might not experience any anxiety at all, even though the problem is real. And on the other end of the spectrum, you can have the exact same problem with somebody else who says, I don't know what to do here, and I'm afraid of the consequences, but I really don't know how to handle this. That person who kind of has this sense of helplessness is going to feel the most anxiety in that particular situation. So there's definitely a relationship between your internal sense of competency versus helplessness in terms of how much anxiety you feel.
Okay, so I wanted to figure out an example. So since Jason and I taught preschool together, if a child has a full-blown meltdown, kicking, screaming, throwing their pretzels up in the air, that is not going to bother me in the least.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be able to handle that with competence. That's good.
Right.
But for a parent, maybe it's not even their kid, but somebody else's kid, and they just watch the tantrum meltdown happen.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
might be really anxiety provoking. Is
Right.
that what you're talking about?
Right.
That other parent doesn't have the same level of competence.
Exactly. And you bring up a good point, which is, it's not necessarily the situation. It could be the exact same situation, but one person perceives it as being an area of expertise and they're fine, no anxiety whatsoever. And that exact same situation, another person says, well, this is an area where I'm a novice or I'm inexperienced. And so I feel lots of anxiety because of this problem. So it's, again, it's not necessarily tied to situation. You can have a genuinely, I think the example I like to give is so let's say you are you have to do brain surgery. That's very different if you are a world-class brain surgeon who's done this a million times, even though absolutely that scenario of, I don't know, cutting open somebody's skull and poking around their brain is very, very dangerous for the person lying on the table.
Yeah.
But that surgeon who's done this, for decades maybe, and has done this exact same surgery hundreds of times, is probably chatting with the nurses about their weekend, while he's, going through the motions of stitching up something in the brain, right? Versus me at some point being a medical student, if I'm in that OR and then that surgeon who's doing something in the brain is just hold this right here, that, I would be freaking out. I would be my fingers would be shaking, because I'm so afraid to do something wrong, right? Now that's the exact same scenario, and the difference is competency, right? And that's a scenario in some kind of extreme situation where we're talking about a genuinely dangerous situation where a lot of bad things can go wrong, but competency versus helplessness, or experience versus inexperience, kind of really changes the way in which a person experiences anxiety, right?
I was wondering about if there's a contributing factor around the societal and people watching or people having an audience, because I think that at least my anxiety goes up if I'm doing something that I maybe, even if I feel somewhat competent, but if there's people that are around that I feel, I don't know,
They're watching or
they're
judging.
watching. I mean, you were talking about raising kids, and yeah, raising the kids is, we don't have an experience, and it's a very important thing. And there's a part of me that's also thinking, there's a lot of people watching. It's like family, friends, internet. If I'm like Instagramming and whatever, like there's like this. There's like
especially if you are a parenting expert.
Yeah, it's a little pressure. So I just wonder if there's a societal piece or an audience piece that is contributing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in any circumstance, I think this is something we completely underestimate, which is to the degree in which we are inherently very, very social beings, right? I think we get caught up in, pretty pervasive idea in Western philosophy of individualism, as if, being a self-sufficient, highly functional, independent person is like the pinnacle of humanness, when in reality, for thousands and thousands of years, and what, well-being research tells us is ultimately we are at our best when we're connected and we're doing meaningful things for others and we're feeling loved. And so we're always very, very relational. So a lot of our experiences in life, including emotions, probably importantly have some awareness of how this is affecting others or how other people are perceiving us. So the kind of how that component is pretty normal. I think that, I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard it so many times that, if you list kind of people's phobias, public speaking is up there as like the highest thing that people are afraid of. And like death is the second. So the joke is, people are more afraid to give the eulogy than to be in the casket, right? Like that's the nature of how much we are afraid of that sort of public scrutiny. So that's definitely a component, I think, of anxiety. I think sometimes in that sort of sense of incompetence that comes with anxiety or perceived sense of incompetence, you can also see how some other feelings come in there, like embarrassment. And embarrassment in particular is that feeling that says I'm becoming hyper aware of what I think other people must be thinking about me. So there's a bit of overlap how you can see that happening. I think part of the healthy responses to anxiety, including in those moments of helplessness, is actually specifically seeing if one of your resources is another person that can help you. And oftentimes that's kind of what relieves our anxiety about our own incompetence, is we actually feel like we have an expert in our lives that can help us, right? So on one hand, there's the maybe exaggerated experience of feeling scrutinized in a sort of more public setting. But at the same time, we're also saying that one of the tools that we should and ought to use when we feel anxious is to reach out for help. And, that, for example, totally applies to parents at this conference who are seeking exactly that. They're seeking advice and support from experts or a community of other parents going through the same situation they are. And if they feel connected and they've learned something, or they feel like they can reach out to people, your anxiety about parenting can decrease. And it's also then very, very normal for children who correctly, if they feel anxious, look to their parents to say, help me with this, because we know that one of the core sort of attachment needs is to feel safe, in that relationship with your caregivers. And that's essentially what that experience is, that a kid is saying, I've identified something in my life that is overwhelming or scary or a problem to me, but I trust that my parents, if they're around or supporting me, that I don't have to be fully responsible with taking care of this problem, because I trust in them. I trust that they're capable. So there is definitely a social component to most emotions, and anxiety is not an exception to that either.
That's great.
Yeah,
and that makes a lot of sense.
Great stuff.
And reaching out for help, really powerful way to shift things, which is a good segue into my question, which was, if we have this sense of helplessness that contributes to anxiety, and we feel not very competent, that contributes to anxiety, or maybe we feel isolated or kind of scrutinized, that contributes to anxiety. If we have all those, is the natural like cure to get competent, to get some support, and to get less helpless feeling about things? Is that how we fix it?
It's one of the ways, right? It definitely is. I think maybe we can then segue into talking about what are the typical, maybe automatic responses that we kind of have in our head once we get anxious, which I think a lot of people might be familiar with, which is fight or flight. So one way to kind of make that a little bit more practical is that if your anxiety is triggered by a problem that you perceive, if your response is to fight, essentially what you're saying is, the way out of this problem is I'm going to solve it. So I am going to take care of this issue that triggered my anxiety. So that's the fight response. And if you do, right, if you approach the problem and you take care of it and it goes away, then that's why you feel relief, because you're saying, oh, good, I took care of it. I no longer have a problem, and therefore there's no reason to be anxious. I feel relieved. The other response, which is flight, says, in your mind, well, I'm not sure if I can handle this, or I'm not sure I have the resources or the help to handle this. So in this circumstance, let me create a safe distance from the problem. Let me get away from the negative impact of the problem. And if I can do that and get myself to a safe distance, which is flight, then again, I'm no longer in harm's way because I'm far away from it now. And because of that, I am also relieved, right? So both of those outcomes, fight or flight, are responses to get to the point of, like no longer in danger, no longer in a place where I could get hurt. So they both function in that kind of way. I think the competency route would be the try to fix the problem. And if you are successful in fixing the problem, then not only to get relief, you also kind of develop this experience that says, that wasn't as bad as I thought. Now I kind of have some experience with that. And that also changes your future experience, because the next time you experience it, it's not like, I've never done this before, I'm completely incompetent. You would actually make a different judgment the next time, because the next time you're faced with that exact same problem, you would say, I have some competence and some experience. And I think proportionally your anxiety would also kind of, be less, right? If the first time, I don't know, on a scale of 1 to 10, you experienced it as an 8, but then you kind of like attempted to fix the problem and it turned out not to be so bad, and you felt like, oh, that was easier than I thought. Then the next time that same problem shows up, you still might be a little bit anxious, but it might be like a 3 or 4. And then also based on your experience, you would also very likely say, let me deal with that, right? Instead of run away from that problem, because I kind of have a sense of what I'm doing here. So that cycle kind of perpetuates itself towards competency anyways, if you try. And each successive attempt to do something, if you have some sense of success, or you make the problem, even if you make the problem just like less bad, I think all those increments of experience, trying, and sometimes the usefulness is just kind of like demystifying the boogeyman. If you approach a problem, you're like, oh, now that I've tried that was not as bad as my imagination made me think it was, And again, this advice goes to parents trying something new with their kids, but this also goes to how parents can coach their kids to say, well, why don't you try? I'll be right here, And if kids can try something, and then they find out again, it's not as scary or difficult as they thought, then they themselves would be like, I don't know what the big deal was, like they'll integrate that. And then the next time they'll be able to, do it with some level of confidence, right? Because they're less likely to be triggered in their anxiety.
So you've been going over the examples of kind of fight and flight. I could see sometimes when like that's a really healthy response, and maybe even sometimes in some situations where it's like not a very healthy response to flight. Like, I'm going to run away from this problem, but I'm not actually, it relieves my anxiety in the short term, but it doesn't actually
Mhm.
help the underlying problem.
Yeah.
So what, how do we with our own anxiety in situations decide, oh, like I should run away from this, or let me stay here and deal with this.
Or how do you harness that
Yeah, like
reaction? Because there's natural reactions. How do you
or
harness
maybe
those
there's a
needs?
healthy way to kind of run away. Maybe it's like I run away and then I return. I don't know.
Yeah. I think between the two, fight or flight, fight would generally be the better option because you'd kind of you'd fix the problem, right? So if you were like a Neanderthal back in the Ice Age or something like that, and there was a saber-toothed tiger, if you and your buddies were able to like take it down, then you'd be like, oh, good, we don't have to worry about the saber-toothed tiger anymore. Versus if you kind of said, uh-oh, let's get away from that, and then now you're like living in caves and hiding because there's always a saber-toothed tiger around, like you've created a distance, but you know that problem's always out there lurking. And so between the two, it is generally better because you can maybe really get some like total relief if you've kind of either solved the problem or developed the competency to deal with that problem in the future. Either way,
fix it. Yeah,
to fix it, that is better. And so I think we should be conscientious to say, like, if my instinct is to run, or to get away, that's a moment where you kind of want to say, like, okay, even if that's my instinct, let me reflect and see, like, should this be a moment where I try to be courageous and approach a problem? Because if I really think it through, it's not as life-threatening or as scary or as damaging, if I attempt to solve the problem, including sometimes, sometimes the reasons we're willing to face problems is because we can convince ourselves that, even if I try and the outcome is not perfect, is that really that bad? And I think oftentimes, the fear of failing in itself makes people choose flight too often. And so there's probably a different conversation in there about how, failure, but trying again is actually the only path towards competency,
yeah.
And so not only is it normal, it is, it's like a requirement of growth, and development. And so we definitely can't be always running away from situations where we say, well, the bad outcome is going to be failure. I don't think that's, if we catch ourselves with that, then sometimes we have to kind of reconsider. It's like, okay, that's not maybe a good enough reason to not try this, especially if, if I can get past this, or I can gain this competency, or I can learn how to do this, or I can solve this problem once and for all, maybe I should try. And being courageous and brave is very specifically, I have anxiety, but I have found a way to choose to do this anyways, right? So being brave and courageous is not the absence of anxiety. It's the ability to say, I have fear and anxiety, but I have the willpower to kind of say, I'm gonna try this regardless. So
yeah, it actually kind of sounds like parenting. That we're not going to be able to do it perfectly.
No.
It
Right,
feels scary.
Yeah.
And even doing it halfway is better than not doing it at all.
Right. And I think you said this before, the threshold for parenting, like most things in life, is good enough. So you don't even have to like do it perfectly, like, ever. Like, that's never
so I want you to say that again, because that's super, super important, because I think there's a lot of people in our audience that their threshold, their own personal threshold for their parenting is really high. And maybe even in this conversation, they're like, oh man, I've got anxiety and I'm going to give it to my kids. And so say what you just said again.
That good enough parenting is actually more than good enough. And there is no like extra bonus points for being closer to perfect, because if we're talking about like what kids need from their parents, leaving their childhood into their adolescence and adulthood, they really don't need perfection. They really don't. They just need like enough love, enough presence, enough support. And when I use that word enough, I'm not like saying 90% enough. I'm saying like 51%, you know, like on this side of good, right? But like just on this side is all you really need. And if their cumulative experience, if the kid's cumulative experience is not that it's perfect, but like for the most part, they're like, yeah, I feel safe with my parents. Yeah, they make me feel like I belong here. Yeah, you know, if I need help, they're reliable enough. Yeah, you know, like if the kid generally has this like, just that's a hair over mediocre assessment of their parents. Like that's actually enough. It really is enough.
And that's actually based on research, right? Like you're not just pulling that out of the air.
Yeah, no. Like enough is really the requirement. You know, and you know why? It's because ultimately we're talking about needs, and because we're talking about needs, the way that we experience needs is only three categories: not enough, in terms of having our needs met; not enough, barely enough, and then more than enough. There's only three, right? It's not actually 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%. It's only three experiences. And not enough is when we feel unpleasant emotions, and that's how we're hardwired, and that's why we have emotions, is because when our needs are not met, it's supposed to trigger this part of us that experiences a feeling to try to get that need met. Barely enough is somewhat satisfying, but sometimes there's some anxiety because you feel like if one thing goes wrong, then I'm going to fall back into the state of not enough. And then there's more than enough, right? And more than enough is just like, I got a little buffer. And, you know, having like perfection doesn't actually create a more amazing experience of more than enough than just whatever, just like crossing the finish line, feeling some relief, phew, you know, is more than enough. And so that's why, you know, it doesn't really, you can't actually objectively break it down into like percentages, you know, because we only, as an experience, we only experience it as needs, as not enough, barely enough, and then more than enough. And so we're just talking about more than enough is all your kids need from you, you know, as parents towards their children.
And what I would guess is anyone that's showing up for this conference is probably going to be meeting those more than enough needs.
They're probably already there.
I mean, that's the beauty of why that's why they're here, right? And so what I start to wonder about is, how can we as parents be enjoying the experience more, right? Like,
and feel that what we're doing is enough.
Yeah, and feel like we're doing it. And so anxiety comes up, right? Like that's why it's so interesting that we're talking about anxiety here, because there's anxiety that parents feel about they're not doing enough, and it just feeds on itself.
Because the experience of parenting is that these stakes are really high, and what you're saying is, yeah, that's the perception, but the reality is that you just got to be good enough.
Right. I think that, you know, built into the uncertainty of parenthood, of course, is that we can't predict the future. And because we can't predict the future, there's always some uncertainty that we can imagine. We can what if ourselves to death, thinking about all the scenarios. At the one time I did this to my kid, is that going to scar them forever? And and so I think there's a lot of like space for us to worry into this giant vacuum of the future. And so I think that's why parenting inherently has some propensity towards concern and worry, you know, especially about our kids' future. And because that also feels like those are the stakes, right? I think one of the challenges is that I think in a lot of cultures, and definitely ours here in America, you know, we don't really get to live in the village, right? So we don't see the multi-generational experience of not just our own family, but like other families going in parallel, sharing lives together. So oftentimes, because of the absence of the ability to experience that it's all going to be okay, you know, comparing ourselves and what we give to our kids and what our, you know, our siblings' families or our neighbors' families, you know, like, because we don't actually have that lived experience as, you know, like we did maybe even just 40, 50 years ago. I think that makes it hard for us to believe that what we're doing is more than enough. I think that's why absolutely people do benefit from joining parenting groups, mommy and me groups, forming communities online, because I think that the actual neighborhood thing is harder these days. But I think it's in those places, again, comparing your experience with other people's experiences who are then in this village, and they're like, oh, I remember those days, and yeah, that's normal, right? And I know I've experienced that so many times, right? Like you're a parent of a young kid, and you're like, oh my gosh, is it normal for my 2-year-old to express his desire to connect with his friends through physical violence? Is that normal, right? And then you got a bunch of preschool teachers are like, yeah, that'll be done in like 2 or 3 months, and it happens. And then 2, 3 months later, like your kid is then able to like not, like wrestle somebody to show that they want to like connect. And then you become that parent who's now like older and more experienced. And then somebody else asks that exact same question. And you're like, oh, you know what? I remember that phase. And I remember I was anxious. And then we have that community that we're like, oh, it would be good for you to hear my story. And we share those stories, right? And we have this like online digital village, but that story is reassuring. And then, so I think that that's also important, to connect with communities where other people have raised kids, are raising kids, especially if somebody's like ahead of you in that experience. But then also if you've gotten ahead in that experience, you have something to contribute to other people. I think that's a big part of what we're missing. And so people have to like actively seek that out, because you don't actually live in those villages anymore where you just like turn your head and there's all these people, doing the same thing, for generations, and it all turns out fine,
And it's interesting you said that, and I started thinking about, when I'm that parent who's gone through it and I get to relate it to another parent, that in a way is a feedback for myself that I have competence in it, which possibly may decrease my anxiety for future things that come up for me, because I remember that like I can develop that competency. So it's interesting how that actually plays back on itself in this conversation around anxiety.
Yeah.
And
even you just being like, yeah, that's no big deal, and being kind of regulated about it helps regulate the other parent.
Totally.
I mean, there's so many different levels of overlap here.
We were we just met with a bunch of our neighbors who are about the same age. Kids are roughly the same age, and we were sharing stories about how we started, how our growing up, like what it was like for us, so that we could actually see how we all turned out. Like
specifically, what did we do in middle school and high school? Like, let's swap the stories.
What did our parents do when we were there?
Right.
What we did.
Yeah, our parents were like, before it gets dark, come home. Right. And then we were just like out there by ourselves doing.
And we shared stories about like I did some dumb stuff when I was in middle school and mostly in high school, dumb stuff, and I turned out okay. And so it was nice for other people to hear that. And I talked, other people were talking about stuff they did, and I'm like, holy cow! And look at you now. And so it gives me like this hope of like, okay, it all turns out like it doesn't have to be perfect. There's some amazing people here whose parents were just good enough and are in certain situations, and man, like that. So that we had that experience a little bit with the village, with the community that we had around us, and talking about it. Because like you said, if you're just with people that are just like you, and you're like, how's this all going to turn out? How are you guys doing? Are we heading down a dark path, or like where's this going to? And not looking at like the bigger picture, it can be a little bit scary.
Yeah, and look, anxiety definitely has a like here and now experience. So I think you do kind of like need to step back and sharing some of these experiences or hearing about other people's parallel experiences, it kind of gives you a better sense of time that's not just trapped in this sort of urgent moment. And that's when we benefit from, support and other people normalizing our experiences, people who are, again, are ahead of this sort of path. And they're like, no, it does turn out okay. And I think built into that too, it just kind of reminded me that I think one of the difficulties as to why people put so much pressure on themselves for their kids is because, look, I'm sure there's a lot of people that are listening to this that actually don't even feel so good about the idea that good enough is actually good enough. Like something about that in itself probably illustrates something about what we think truly is good enough. Like people are questioning if we're saying, does good enough mean, making six figures, happily married, two children, living in the suburbs, or more realistically.
Or and how could that possibly mean less?
Yeah,
It actually
right.
could mean
Yeah. And what
it's
version
quite
of
a
good
bit
enough
less.
is any less than that, right? So I think based on the sort of way that we're trying to describe, what is really good, right? I think then really defines what we say is good enough. And so I'm saying that good is somebody who's connected with other people, who is self-motivated, who knows how to solve problems, who knows when to ask for help, who generally has an awareness of other people's needs and can be activated to act to help others, a person who likes to learn, who likes to grow, person who can be flexible when they need to be flexible. Because those are the kind of like the traits and characteristics that, again, are good enough, because that toolkit that I just described works like everywhere in all scenarios throughout life, whether we're talking about the job situation, relationship situations, any other sort of area of life. That skill set that I just described is more than good enough to handle life, even as life changes, even as life adapts. And so I think that's maybe the specific sort of carryover that we're talking about. Like, if your kids can experience, certain things from their parents, or the exposure of experiences they have as children, where they get to grow, they get to learn from their mistakes. They don't have to feel like they have to be perfect. They have places where they get to make friends. Adolescence provides an amazing opportunity to learn how to make your own friends, fail at friendship, try to get friends back, how to develop social skills. That's a normal part of adolescence, and so even that built into our normal development is also this scaffolding that helps people also get to those exact same skills. And so us as parents, we're just trying to, get our kids to have these kinds of experiences going forward, in their childhood. And it doesn't require like the perfect childhood of the right ratio of extracurricular activities, what kind of grades, and all those sort of scenarios that maybe in another context would be the measure of good enough. But we're talking about like the life skill set that ultimately is translatable to life, in many scenarios. Yeah.
And I want to clarify one point, that when you were describing like what is good, I think you were talking about those are the qualities that the parent has, right? And then if they're just doing those things, then the kids will naturally get those things too. Or was it like a list of make sure your kids have these qualities?
I think that's maybe the list of qualities that I would generally say like a healthy person would experience, right? So I think those are both the things that we can strive for as people, including for adults, in our own areas of personal growth. We can still grow in those areas, but I think those are also kind of the types of things of traits and experiences and tools that we want our kids to also develop through their life experiences. And you get those things not necessarily because you take a class, on them, but you get those things, through learning about your feelings, being aware of your own needs, becoming competent in being able to meet your needs or get the help for other people to help you with those things, having meaningful relationships, practicing in friendships, learning to be kind and generous and sharing, and also learning how to know limits within yourself, so that you don't sort of put yourself in situations that you're overreaching. I'm kind of just, hopefully I'm just describing like, the types of typical life experiences that we all come by no matter what, as human beings. And there's just all those spaces are where the places where people get to learn these lessons. And again, with this help and support of their parents, but sometimes also on their own, as they grow in their own autonomy as well.
Great. Oh gosh, there's so many things. I want to just like wrap up and like just say kind of like a couple of takeaways that I've gotten kind of in conclusion. So I've heard be a good enough parent. I've heard ask for help, like get connected to a community. I've heard that ultimately, if we're feeling some anxiety, that going around and trying to fix the problem so it goes away
Mhm.
it can be a really powerful strategy and help us feel more competent and take away our helplessness.
Mhm.
And if you disagree with any of these, you jump in, Joe.
Mhm.
What else?
You talked about reaching or getting some training or having support around so that you feel less anxiety because you've got that support around you. That goes along with the community a little
Yeah.
bit.
Mhm.
And also as parents, if we're dealing with our own anxiety, that helps our kids be less anxious also.
And anxiety can be a very positive emotion by telling us, hey, pay attention to this thing.
Mm.
Right.
And not enough anxiety or attention on something that maybe we should pay attention to can be kind of problematic. So we're trying
Right.
to find that sweet spot.
Mhm.
Uh,
Right.
Anything we missed?
yeah.
Anything
Is
that
that a good summary?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's good. I think, what we want to, I think, really emphasize is essentially that emotions are normal. Having anxiety is normal and good. And the mastery of anxiety is something that both kids and parents can achieve. There's a specific experience and toolkit. There's also kind of like a path, that we can all kind of like teach ourselves or model for our children, where it's basically, okay, anxiety. Okay, so what are you noticing? What's the problem? Okay, do I need help with that? Do I have the tools and the abilities to solve that? How can I, approach this problem? I don't have to do it by myself, and these are kind of like that's the script. And inevitably, if you kind of keep following that sort of script in different scenarios where you have anxiety, more likely than not, the experience of either getting better, demystifying how serious the problems are, so your judgment becomes better about these things in the future, growing in your experience or competency, finding reliable help. There's so many ways in that script of dealing with anxiety where you will feel less anxiety and more competent in more and more situations as you grow up. And so that's how we manage our own anxiety as parents. This is how we coach our kids, including anxious kids, that we've identified are anxious. It's still the same script. And ultimately, all those increments, in all of those situations, become translatable at some point into like a generic confidence that people have, because they become problem solvers in a lot of these situations. And so there is an encouragement, in the midst of kind of our conversation today about what otherwise probably is a anxiety provoking topic of anxiety, but it is definitely a scenario and situation where people can absolutely grow in their ability to do better, and we absolutely can help our kids get better in these areas too.
That's great.
Yeah. And if anybody has overwhelming anxiety and doesn't know what to do with it, reach out, get some professional help.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we're talking about very specifically, help, or a type of anxiety that seems outside the scope of, let's say, parents' ability, then absolutely, that's part of reaching out for appropriate help, sometimes professional help.
It's great. This is such a fun conversation to have with you. It's always interesting. Our conversations always turn into something more than what we expect them to be. We appreciate what you've said. You did a nice little wrap up there for us. How could people find out more about what you're doing, what you write about, and your practice?
So maybe the central place to kind of hear what I'm doing and other sort of topics we've talked about at press conferences or things I've written about is my website, which is mentalhealthiness.com. And there's different articles that I've written about the positive value of emotions, the positive value of relationships, other things about parenting, anxiety in particular, and different things like that. So that's a good place to find out maybe more, expand upon some of the ideas that maybe we only got to touch upon, today about anxiety. But yeah, my website, mentalhealthiness.com.
Great. We'll include a link to that in the speaker notes. I think you also, if I remember right, you also have some of our past interviews from past conferences on your blog, so people can check out some of our past conversations. Do you have the anger video on there as well? The interview we did about anger, maybe?
I believe I do. Yes. Yeah.
So that was a fantastic conversation as well. So thank you again for your time here, Joey. It's so fun to talk to you, and thank you for the insight that you give and the reassurance that, you know, parenting, it's just about being good enough, and it's that can be calming and less anxious for all of us. So we look forward to talking to you again in the future, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.